And it was really interesting to not only hear from him, but his testimony allowed prosecutors to play recorded conversations with Elizabeth Holmes, who is basically recorded making a lot of claims that appear, now that we've heard from other people in the Theranos company, to be wild exaggerations of her device's capabilities, and also of the financial condition of her company in and around 2013, when the article was written. So that was a huge development. That was one of the last witnesses. Also, the prosecution called 2 or 3 patients, one of which used the Theranos device, as a pregnancy test. It gave her a false result. It told her that she wasn't pregnant when she actually was. And so she took a host of medication that pregnant women shouldn't be taking, and endangered her baby, her pregnancy, her family. And so I think that was compelling testimony for the jury to hear, particularly because the other class of people who are accused, or the accusers are accusing Elizabeth Holmes of defrauding them, are investors. And frankly, some of these investors have not been the most sympathetic people, I think, in front of a jury. They tend to be very wealthy individuals. Some of them come across, in my view, as a little pushy, maybe as a little entitled. But I think that the patient stories have a chance to resonate a lot more fully as this trial proceeds.
Yeah, so really the fraud charges, and we talked about this on the podcast, but they come down to those 2 classes of people, right? On the one hand, it's the patients. On the other hand, it's the investors.
That's right.
And so, talking about the investors, can you rattle off for us some of the folks that were involved in that? And there's been a lot of talk about this document with Pfizer's logo on it. Give us the backstory there.
All right. Yeah, let's do it. So basically, not all the investors, who are some of the big names. Like when we first got the prosecution witness list, it was 110 names long. And there were some names like Rupert Murdoch, who did invest $100 million into Theranos, some members of the Walton family. Of course, the Walton family are those who founded Walmart. And also the DeVos family, I think, is another notable investor. Former Secretary of Education under Donald Trump, Betsy DeVos, is part of that family, although she was not involved in the actual investments themselves, but her family members were. They run a company called Amway down in Florida, which is, I think, a marketing and beauty product company. I'm not really sure. That's a little bit obscure. But anyway, so those 3 are some of the big name investors. None of them have testified. But, on behalf of the DeVos family, for instance, it was Lisa Peterson, who is their investment manager, testified, and some other folks from some Silicon Valley hedge funds and some venture capital funds have basically come into the court. And they've kind of all, it's been a very scripted, the government prosecutors walk them through why, how they first became attracted to Theranos, why they decided to invest, and then, how ultimately their investment went south.
So Elizabeth Holmes has been at trial. We talked about this again a little bit in our interview, but since then she has actually taken the stand. So
indeed.
You talked about her demeanor, and I think that it's really interesting, kind of the poise you mentioned, that she's sort of been very calm, cool, and collected, and perhaps that could be one of those things that appeals to the jury, as kind of hoping that, on her side, hoping that they might have a little bit of empathy or sympathy for her. Tell us about her testimony. What's happened?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is listen, the trial, I think, we've gone through, this trial started on September 8th, and at times it's been a slog through technical details about organic chemistry and blood testing. Sometimes the boredom of the jury is palpable. It's hard to get a read on the jury because they're in masks, but, some parts of this testimony, you can just really feel it drag, particularly because the defense strategy is a lot about muddying the waters. But now, the most dramatic moment in the trial came on Friday, just because when the defense picked, it was their turn to go. They chose two witnesses, and then all of a sudden, after the second witness, who was a doctor who served on Theranos' board, Elizabeth Holmes just stood up without her name being called, and you could hear the audible gasp in the courtroom. And yeah, she made her way, and then sat down, took her mask off, which was, by the way, was something that the prosecution fought hard for. They wanted her to be able to take off her mask, so that she could, because they're seeking to humanize her, as you alluded to in your question, right? They want the jury to see the full person that is Elizabeth Holmes, and I think that they want to instill, sort of sympathy for her. And so on Friday, they basically just walked through her kind of brief biography, where she was born. I think she was born in California, maybe moved to Washington, D.C., went to high school in Houston, Stanford dropout, kind of the early days of her company. And her testimony has gotten so far, has kind of taken us through 2008, 2009. So we're not really to the part of the timeline where we get to some of the most highly contested parts of this trial, including, that round of funding where she was, allegedly using Pfizer logos on internally produced documents. The government claims that Mrs. Holmes did that to give her company the veneer of a company that was, approved, whose technology was approved by some of the largest pharmaceutical companies, in existence. But they say that those pharmaceutical companies were not actually interested in Theranos technology, and that had ceased doing business with Theranos. And that, basically Elizabeth Holmes was perpetuating this fraud as a means of getting more investment, to personally enrich herself. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at in the trial. I have to say that, and I described Ms. Holmes as very poised throughout the trial. There's been some very intensely cringeworthy moments. Her former business partner, Ramesh Balwani, who was referred to as Sonny in the trial, was also her romantic partner. So there's a lot of embarrassing texts that have been divulged through the course of this trial. Right. And she has remained poised, I think, throughout that, maintains a very kind of straight, upright stance. And we haven't gotten a lot of reaction from her in the courtroom. But now that it's her turn to tell her story about her company and basically defend herself from these charges, I have to say, I think that her performance has been impressive so far as a witness. I think she comes across as credible. She comes across as genuine. She makes eye contact with the jury at times. She laughs at times. She seems relaxed. And, Elizabeth Holmes is no dummy, right? She's a very intelligent woman, and I think that comes across in her testimony.
So you mentioned Sunny Balwani, and again, something we talked about in those text messages being kind of a piece of trial. But tell us a little bit more. So Balwani is also charged
right.
with, related to this, but not together. So what happened there, and how does he kind of fit into her defense?
Yeah, so exactly, this is a great question, and we'll see. I mean, this is going to be the most. I really feel like this trial will hinge on probably the next 2 or 3 days of testimony. That's where we're at right now. And because right now, what we did today is, Kevin Downey, who's the attorney for Holmes, is just walking Elizabeth through all these pharmaceutical contracts. And they're just laying a foundation for the fact that actually Theranos did do business with a lot of different pharmaceutical companies. And they ran a lot of trials, some of which, pharmaceutical companies approved and signed off on. So that's kind of where we're at right now. But in terms of Sunny Balwani, I mean, the theory all along is that the defense strategy was going to be, to the extent that there is fraud at Theranos, was fraud at Theranos, it was the fault of Sunny Balwani and not Elizabeth Holmes. And I think that the reason that's appeared credible to some people is because Sunny Balwani was romantically involved with Elizabeth Holmes. Elizabeth Holmes met Mr. Balwani originally when she was, I think, 18 years old, between her high school year and her freshman year at Stanford. He was a 37-year-old successful tech executive at the time. They stay in touch. Holmes actually, she founds her company more on the advice of a Stanford professor. She basically starts the company with a business plan that she formulated in an entrepreneurial class at Stanford. And then as the company grows and as things get a little more serious and she begins to garner a little more attention, she brings Balwani and his experience on. And so the theory out there, and we'll have to see if this happens or not, but the theory is, especially because as she's testifying right now, we're through 2009 on her timeline as she's testifying, and things seem to be going swimmingly for Ms. Holmes and Theranos. And so the theory at trial, and we talked to a lot of reporters, and there's actually a lot of people who just, a lot of interested lawyers who watch the trial as well. And, the general theory is that Ms. Holmes is going to say when things started to go south, particularly around 12 and 13 and 14, that, most of that, if not all of that, was the result of the sort of business leadership and the decisions that were made by Balwani and not Ms. Holmes.
So we talked a little bit about just Holmes at trial and kind of how that's going, but I'm assuming that most of us listening in don't have the exposure on the ground that you have, being there in federal court. So just tell us a little bit about that. I mean, I know there's people in the public coming. There's obviously a lot of reporters there, and even some fans of Elizabeth Holmes.
That's true. Yeah. So the first day was an absolute circus. And then as the trial got bogged down in some of the technical details, it was kind of like a more core cast of reporters, but also some trial watchers. There's an engineer who works in Silicon Valley who I've been talking to throughout. I'm not going to share his name, but he's there almost every day. A couple lawyers who come down here and there, just to see how their colleagues are lawyering this thing, right? But yeah, the first day was an absolute circus, just tons of cameras all over the place. And there were these 4 gals, I want to say they're from Norway, but maybe it's Sweden, some country in Scandinavia. And they all dressed up like Elizabeth Holmes and were waving to her. There's one lady who likes to come and shout encouraging things to Elizabeth Holmes about how she's going to be a good mother. Although she got in trouble with the judge, I think, because, she was shouting these things, these kind of pro-Elizabeth Holmes things in, around where the jury is, which is a big no-no. Trials, as anybody who follows any kind of trial, federal court or otherwise, knows. But so, like I said, a huge circus the first day, very, not so much in recent weeks. But then, of course, Elizabeth Holmes stood up and took the trial. So this morning, I live here in Santa Cruz, which is about, 45 minutes as a crow flies if there's no traffic, which, of course, there's always traffic. But anyway, today I woke up at 4:30 and I got to the courtroom like around 5:45. I thought I was going to be one of the first people there. I was actually the 50th person in line.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So there'd been somebody had actually, I think the first person got there at midnight last night. Some other people started to trickle in at 1:30. One of my colleagues, Dorothy, said that she got a hotel outside the courtroom, and like when she woke up and looked at like 4:15 and saw people gathering, that's when she went down. So it just gives you an idea, right, of the interest that this trial has generated. And I would say like today, it was probably 50-50 journalists and just people who wanted to catch a glimpse. Once the trial started, like I told you before, this is like, how trials are, right? So they're just walking through a lot of pharmaceutical contracts at this point. So, the room started to thin out after I think people, realized what a slog trials can be. But there's no doubt that there's a lot of public interest in this trial. There's no doubt that Elizabeth Holmes remains a charismatic and enigmatic figure that draws a lot of public interest.
Describe that first day as a circus, and at the risk of being incredibly corny, it sounds like the circus is back in town.
That's not corny. That's accurate. The circus is back in town, and it probably will be back in town tomorrow. We're off on Wednesday for a getaway day, I think, on Thanksgiving. But I expect Holmes will probably go all day tomorrow. I think, from a strategy perspective, that the defense, her attorneys, would probably like to keep her on the stand all day tomorrow and to even close tomorrow's day without the prosecution having a chance at her, so that the jury goes kind of on Thanksgiving break, right, with like a kind of rosy picture of Ms. Holmes in their mind, and gets to, marinate on that a little bit over the holiday before they come back. And then, of course, the cross-examination of Ms. Elizabeth Holmes is going to be the most compelling and interesting part of this trial. Because, as you alluded to before, there's these forged Pfizer documents, there's these accusations that she was misrepresenting the financial condition of her company to investors, which is a huge no-no. And then, of course, there's accusations that she kind of was talking up all of these contracts that Theranos had with the Department of Defense, even to be able to do these blood tests that monitor for blood infection, on the battlefield and medevac helicopters and stuff like that. And that, I think, is a gross exaggeration. That's what it turned out. So the prosecution is going to ask her a lot of tough questions, which is why I think when Elizabeth Holmes stood up on Friday to take the stand, it was actually, I think, a complete surprise. A lot of people speculated that, that basically the defense strategy was going to be to foist the blame onto Balwani, and that there was going to be a bunch of witnesses that talked about how Balwani was really running the show, but that they were going to keep Holmes off of the stand to keep her away from tough and rigorous questioning from the prosecutors. That has turned out not to be true. Obviously, the defense team has a lot of faith in Elizabeth Holmes' abilities to understand or to kind of answer these questions. And we shall see if their faith is misplaced or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great place to leave it off, but I will just, thank everyone for tuning in. And a quick plug, we are Courthouse News reporters bringing you this report. I'm coming for Brooklyn, and Matt Rendan's coming from the West Coast. We also recently, our most recent episode of Sidebar talks about this, among some other interesting topics, so definitely check that out. We're a Sidebar on Twitter, Sidebar CNS on Twitter, and you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Also, definitely keep checking out courthousenews.com for Matt's continued coverage of the Theranos trial. Thanks so much for tuning in. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Nina. It was a pleasure.
All right. Bye, all.